I start, this is Anya. I did want to offer my thanks to all of you. It has really been an incredibly interesting, fulfilling, and actually humbling experience to be in communion with all of you in the last day and a half. I wasn't sure what to expect at this seminar, but I, especially, as I will say in a moment, I'm not an American Studies person, which I also hope you understood from my bio. So, setting expectations appropriately. But what I have noticed is that I have been able to participate in many of the conversations and contribute in addition to learning from you. So I wanted to first offer my thanks to all of you for having me in your midst. The second thing I wanted to do in the spirit of collaboration is to connect to a seminar we had earlier with respect to Indigenous communities. There's a question that was posed to our speakers about, well, I know we shouldn't necessarily ask you this, but what resources can you share with us to help us learn? So in the spirit of collaboration, I would like to offer a couple of resources that on that topic that I think are useful that I've learned from. The first, connecting with the spirit of this room, has to do with the ways in which we learn from culture to understand the issues that we're exploring here. And there's an artist that I use in my own work that I've learned from. Her name is Jean Quick-to-See Smith. And she has a particular painting, an oil, it was done in 2000, called State Names. And when Vicky Stott spoke about her connection or lack thereof of the particular state names, I thought about Jean Quick-to-See Smith's work, and I recommend that to you. One of the ways that we can deepen our intellectual engagement with these issues is through art and culture, which of course is what Max Reinhardt was all about. Second, there's a new book out by my colleague in history, Ned Blackhawk, called Rediscovering America. And I've learned a lot from that book, and I highly recommend it to all of you. Okay, now to this lecture. Charles told me, and I actually did have some prepared text that I was going to give. But Charles said that the lecture has, historically, I don't think there have been that many of them, been, informal, often autobiographical, in addition to an opportunity for the speaker to share their current work, their intellectual trajectory, and so on. So I thought I would actually start with a bit of autobiography, at least my academic autobiography, as a way of situating my work. And for those of you who actually do American Studies, maybe you will find in the autobiography of my academic work some points of connection, and maybe at the end of this talk you will identify me as one of you, and maybe I can join the club. Okay, so I'm a law professor. I do social science. I am not a trained social scientist, but I do play one on TV. I am a trained engineer. I'm very good at math. As an engineer, I took 5 semesters of calculus, multiple semesters of physics, 3 semesters of chemistry, countless engineering classes. I was trained first as an electrical engineer, and I ultimately obtained a degree in structural design engineering. And so I approach the problems that I do in the social space in the way that an engineer would do. It's a problem, it needs to be fixed. What tools would I use to both understand the problem and to address it. Because I'm a lawyer and I'm not trained in a discipline, I've been very peripatetic. As I will explain, I've basically voraciously attacked different disciplines, starting first in sociology, next in social psychology. Now I'm in political theory. And each decade of my academic career, I've been a law professor for 30 years, I have managed, I think, to integrate these disciplines into a coherent whole. Where I started, as I was explaining to Fernando earlier today, is thinking about how law operated in communities that experience violence, usually gun violence. And in fact, the reason why I must leave promptly at 9:30 is because I have a board meeting for an organization that I've been working with, Project Unloaded, that is seeking to convince children to think differently about guns after decades of their persuasion by the NRA that guns make them safe, even though they don't. Project Unloaded has looked to the cigarette campaign, smoking campaign that took place in the 70s when I was a kid, and used trying to build on the success of that as a model to persuade youth not to pick up a gun. But that's where I started. And it was through sociology that was actually unusual for a law professor at the time, that I started to focus on how the community experiences law and how communities can actually be activated to make their own social network and space stronger. That, at least in the United States context, was not a way that people thought about how law should be deployed. I was brought up in the context of the ascendancy of law and economics, where the model was to look at Homo economicus and see, well, what penalties can we use for a person to motivate them not to break the law? As I mentioned in Calliope's session today, I looked to sociology from an earlier period, the urban sociology of the Chicago School, where it was very clear that while at that time people were quick to demonize certain groups that lived in the cities in particular times, oh, this community is high crime because the Germans live there. This community is high crime because the Italians live there. What the urban sociologists in that period in the 20s found was that it was the same places that experienced high rates of crime over time. So if that were true, it had to be something about the place and not the people. And that was that observation, at the time, social disorganization theory, which I renamed social organization theory in my own early work, was a way of trying to figure out how to use law to activate norms to help communities help themselves keep safe. Now, after the turn of sociology, I started thinking about a different question. And that was, since the economists were focused, obsessed really, with deterrence and the question of why people break the law, I thought, well, maybe we should be focusing on a different question. Why do people obey the law? Because it turns out that most people obey the law most of the time. Even a serial killer, to use the proverbial criminal that everyone is afraid of, obeys the law most of the time. A serial killer doesn't go to the grocery store and constantly shoplift. A serial killer doesn't run red lights. A serial killer doesn't randomly punch people in the jaw as he usually walks down the street, right? So how do we understand why people obey the law? Well, for that, I turned to social psychology. And there's a particular theory offered by my colleague, co-author, and I'm being recorded, so I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, work husband, Tom Tyler, who developed a theory of social psychology called procedural justice. And inaptly named, for reasons I will explain, but that's the name that the theorist who came up with it in the 1950s gave it, so that's what we're stuck with. But what procedural justice says is that people are more likely to obey the law if they perceive the law and those who are dictating law to them as legitimate. Now understand, when I'm using the term legitimate, I am not talking about a philosophical theory. This is not a normative theory. I am talking about positive social science. When do we observe people actually complying with the law and under what conditions, right? And so legitimacy in this context is defined as voluntarily obeying the law, and that definition has been expanded to concepts of when people will voluntarily obey the law, cooperate with officials, or voluntarily engage with them. And Tyler's theory says, well, this will happen if four things are true. First, if people have an opportunity to tell their side, well, first of all, let me back up. The theory is developed in a context in which you have an individual interacting with a legal official. So what is the context in which that person is going to voluntarily do what the official is asking them to do? First, if the person has an opportunity to tell their side of the story, give perspective on their story, and explain what they're doing. In social psychology, we call that voice. Second, if a person is treated with dignity and respect, taken seriously, has the official exhibit concern for their rights. Third, people in interactions with authority are going to look for indicia of fairness of decisions. What does that mean? Well, they're looking for indicia that the official is making a decision based on facts, that the decision is transparent, that the decision maker is making the decision in a context without bias, that the decision making is consistent, it doesn't flip-flop and so on. Those are called indicia of fair decision making. And finally, the fourth factor is people want to believe that the person that they're dealing with, the official, will treat them benevolently in the future, right? So those are the four factors of procedural justice. When I give talks about this, I often say that you can boil those four factors down to this. In interactions with legal authorities, people want to believe that the authority they're dealing with believes that they count. And they can only make that assessment by looking at how that official is treating them, because we can't read minds, or at least I can't. Maybe some of you have a secret, I don't know. And we've found in our research that this idea of procedural justice doesn't apply only to interactions with authorities, but it also applies to how people think about law itself. Now, what's really interesting, and I think that's relevant to what we've been talking about today, or maybe what you all talk about in many of these sessions, is why is it that people care about this? All right, so Tyler and his colleagues didn't develop procedural justice theory on their own. This was a theory developed by other psychologists named Thibault and Walker, if we're keeping track of all the names. And Thibault and Walker said, well, the people care about this because it's basically a control theory. Often in conditions of uncertainty, you don't know what the outcome of a particular interaction, a decision is going to be. They were focusing on courts. And because you don't know, what you can observe is process, which is why it's called procedural justice. And it turns out, though, and this was the Tyler intervention, that people care more about the process than they care about the outcome itself. So the early experiments showed that even though people obviously care about appropriate and fair distributive outcomes, that's an issue that we've been talking about a lot today. If people have to choose between the two, they actually care more about the 4 factors of procedural justice than they care about, for example, getting a raise, right? Why is that? Why would that be? Well, that's where Tyler and Alan Lind come in. And their work showed, because they're social psychologists, that the reason why people care about this is because of group value theory. People are constantly looking for information about their value in society, both individually and with respect to their membership in a group. And it turns out that how state officials treat you as an individual or how state officials treat your group gives you a lot of information of how much value you have in society. So these factors of procedural justice turn out to be really important for that kind of information, right? I want to know that the official in question thinks that I count, thinks that I have value. And I'm going to look to those 4 factors. So I spent a lot of time on this theory for about 10 years. I was one of the first people to translate this idea to the context of policing. And in my service on President Obama's Task Force in 21st Century Policing, one of the things that we did at that task force, or I did, was to convince the other 10 people on the task force, who included police chiefs and sheriffs and a union organizer and activists and a civil rights lawyer and Brian Stevenson, who's in a category all by himself, that we should organize our 59 recommendations about how to change policing at that time, almost a decade ago, 9 years ago, around this theory of procedural justice, which is a mechanism for creating trust in officials, institutional leaders, state officials, the law. And here we are, almost 10 years later, and the work has proceeded at pace despite a 4-year gap during the Trump administration, where it was literally forbidden to use the words procedural justice in the Department of Justice, even though it's a social science theory. It's not like we made it up. It was quite strange. But there were a lot of things that were a little strange about that period of time. So doing this work at the federal level, at the state level, I am also on the monitoring team for the Baltimore Police Department. Many consent decrees around the country have built this work into policies and so on that the departments who are under consent decree have to adopt. I am a commissioner on the New Haven Board of Police Commission, and we have adopted a procedural justice audit of all of our policy. So this is a really important way, I think, thinking back to something that Charles said earlier about academics who can go write another article that maybe someone will read. I think somebody read my article. I think it actually made a difference in the world, but not a big enough difference. We're in 2023, and the Minneapolis Police Department is under consent decree, and the Minneapolis Police Department has actually been trained under my training, and it is incredibly distressing when you read what happens. We're living in a world in which police leaders understand the importance of what they say is community policing and the importance of building trust, but not building trust in a way in which communities are designed or allowed to or encouraged to articulate their own goals and projects for policing, but instead, too many police leaders think about building trust for purposes of having community leaders just follow in lockstep what they want to do. I have often said to these leaders that you are a policing agency, and if you are an agent, then you need a principal. And the principal is the community, not you. And they'll listen, but okay, so how do we explain the resistance? Well, that brings me, I think, to another body of social psychology called intergroup relations. So let me back up a minute. And now I'm actually taking a bit of text. If you want to read it yourself, it's not behind a paywall. The article is called "The Wolf We Feed, : because all law professors have to have colons in their title. The Wolf We Feed, : Democracy, Caste, and Legitimacy. And this is a piece I wrote with a historian of education. And what we do is we sort of go through the particular history of caste legitimacy in the United States. And by caste legitimacy, I mean the fact that in the US, the law was not legitimate unless it denied certain groups of people certain civic goods. Jim Crow was considered a legitimate form that the state should take, right? And how do we explain that in light of the group value theory that I was just talking about, which, by the way, as I explain in the article, is universal. What do I mean by that? If you ask any group what they require to come to conclusions about the fairness of legal authorities, they will all say the same things, those same 4 things. In the United States, it doesn't matter if you are asking Black people, white people, Latine people, which are the people who are the primary groups that have been surveyed in this work, they will all say the same things. This work has been done in countries across the globe. Everybody focuses on the same 4 things, which has caused the social psychologists who do this work to think, well, these are universal principles. It's universal. So if we do it, then we should achieve benefits, which is what was motivating me to do the work. But then here we are. How do we explain this? Well, there's another branch of social psychology called intergroup relations. Now, these are the people who study, at least in the United States, study race discrimination. Their forebear is a psychologist named Gordon Allport. I don't know if that name sounds familiar to you. These are the people who study things like social dominance theory and stereotype threat. These are the people who have unbelievable experiments who can show you that they do a thing called priming, where people have images that flash that flash before them, and these psychologists can show that if you look at images of faces of Black people, then the study participants are more likely or can more easily or more specifically more quickly, that's how they do it. How fast can you see certain things? They'll have a fuzzy picture of a gun, very fuzzy outline, and the picture becomes gradually more sharp. And if you see pictures of Black people, you'll identify the gun much more quickly. Because in the United States, Blackness is associated with criminality, for example. And we go through many of the other experiments in the article. Now, intergroup relations suggests that caste legitimacy is durable and very difficult to eradicate. So that's what those folks are saying in one branch of social psychology. The intra-group relations people, the people that I've been playing with for the last decade, are like, look, if you treat everybody fairly, if you treat them with respect to these indicia of procedural justice, we'll do better. We'll actually eradicate the kinds of behaviors that intergroup relations folks tell you will lead to negative consequences. So in the article, what we do is we sort of say, well, how do we deal with the fact that these two bodies of research are pointing in fundamentally different directions? So my co-author and I tried to look to see whether these groups of researchers were playing together. And in particular, we wanted to see whether the intra-group relations people, that's the procedural justice people, asked the following question. We know those people asked this question about what do you require to come to conclusions of fairness of legal authority. And we know that every group says the same thing. But do the intra-group relations people ever ask members of other groups whether they want those things for other people? We found 2 studies, just 2. Because it seems so obvious that if it's the kind of thing that everybody wants for themselves, of course, why wouldn't you want that for other people? Well, one answer is Jim Crow. I don't know. You know, we have countless examples where the legitimacy of law literally depended on the denial of these civic goods to quote unquote outgroups. So at the end of the piece, we do because you know, I'm a law professor. My co-author is a historian, so he's less concerned about this, but you know, well, what are we gonna do? Well, we need to have a call to action at the end of the piece. And we suggest a few things that I think might be relevant to different members of this room. One thing we do is we say to researchers, well, you need to be asking different questions, obviously. The intra-group relations people need to be asking the questions, okay, do you want these things for these other groups? If not, why not? You know, do the research. And you can't actually come up with evidence that's useful for policymaking unless you ask the right questions. As I often say in the context of policing policy circles, where people often say, well, we just want to do what works. We need evidence-based policy of what works. Anybody who's ever been in a White House context knows what I'm talking about, right, Karen? I say, sure, evidence policy is great, but all evidence is a set of facts that you offer to answer a question. Theory tells you what questions to ask. And if you're not asking the right questions, you won't get the right facts. So let's think about theory, researchers, ask the right questions so that we can produce the right evidence. The second thing we suggest is actually to have people who are working on the ground take a page out of the book of researchers. And there you want to build on the priming research. Okay, now bear with me a little, because I'm not suggesting that the policy intervention is to showing people pictures. I don't mean that. But what we do know about the priming research is that suggestion can make people think differently about subjects in a negative way. It stands to reason that you can prime people in the opposite direction and make them think positively about groups in the opposite direction. But what would be our instrument? Policy actually is a primer, we think,
right? And we've seen this historically, that when you have really big policy interventions, you prime people to think differently about different things. That does suggest that our current approach of sort of tinkering around the sides is not a good idea, and that really big interventions can make a difference even if they don't work well. I'll use for an example, which I don't talk about in the piece, but I do think this is an example, Obamacare, with all its flaws, actually has made people think very differently about their relationship to healthcare and their expectations and their rights around that. Civil rights law is a little bit more complicated, but we can have that conversation in the question and answer if you're interested. And then finally, in the piece, we say that we have to think differently about time. And that's a hard pill for young people especially to swallow. I've been doing work on police reform for 30 years. And we've made some progress, not nearly enough, not nearly as much as I want to make. And I understand that the time horizon is longer still. We just have to keep at it. That's what we've got. We have no choice. And my grandmother, who was born in Selma, Alabama, as my mother was a civil rights activist, and she called me Lucy Jane. I don't know why. None of my names are Lucy none of my names is Lucy or Jane, but she called me Lucy Jane, and she said, Lucy Jane, you have been given a gift by God, and it is your job to use it, and that's just what you have to do. You have no choice. So everything I do to honor my grandmother and my ancestors, hope or no hope. That's just what you do. And why do we have to keep trying? Well, this goes to the title of this article, before the colon, The Wolf We Feed, which actually pertains to it's a parable, we'll call it, that's been attributed to the Cherokee and Lenape traditions. And I actually looked this up after our conversation yesterday. I actually made my co-author check to make sure as the way we cited it. We looked at, Vicki, or maybe Karen, you were the one who said this, tribal websites. And there are, even though I'm sure this is apocryphal or something, I don't know, but there are some tribal websites that actually say this is our tradition, so I am going to use it as they say it, but here's the way the tradition goes. There are two wolves, and one wolf is evil, and it represents all the worst attributes of humanity: rage, arrogance, self-pity, cruelty, deceitfulness, fear, and greed. The other wolf is good and represents kindness and humility, peace and joy, truthfulness, generosity, and hope. And the wolf who wins the fight in our hearts is the one that we feed. So let's start feeding that wolf. Thank you.